All right, welcome back to another episode of EventHubs Talking Block. I am John Catalyst Green. With me, as always, is John Velociraptor Guerrero.
Hello. I'm waiting for Street Fighter 6's release date. John, do you have any new information? Anything, something, official, unofficial, anything? I'm jonesing over here for some Street Fighter 6 news.
Yeah, official and unofficial, we have actually both of that. So we know the game is coming in 2023. We don't know exactly when just yet. However, the game was recently rated in South Korea. And when that has happened in the past, at least in a few cases, the title has released 3 to 6 months later on. So we know that the game is fairly close. It's not going to be a super long timeline from this point out, because when you're submitting to the ratings board, you have to submit a mostly final product. It's got to basically be there for the ratings board to get it through there.
Yeah.
And if we go based on that timeline, it would mean that Street Fighter 6 will be released either in February or May of next year, which seems like a really fair estimate given everything that we know. Now, Capcom very often likes to release their fighting game titles before the end of their fiscal year, which is scheduled currently for March 31st, 2023. However, last month, in a financial report by Capcom, they indicated that the company only intended to release one major title in the 2022 fiscal year, which again ends in March 31st, 2023. Fiscal years can differ from actual dates. It's just, that's how accounting works. So anyway, that game is believed to be Resident Evil 4 Remake, which is, of course, a gigantic title.
Is it? Is that going to be a big release, you think? Or is that like, a little double A? No, I'm just kidding. That's like probably their biggest, arguably like right there on par, maybe bigger than a new Street Fighter. We don't need to split hairs over it, but yeah. So as excited as I am for Resident Evil 4 Remake, it did kind of, rain on our Street Fighter 6 potential parade there. So sad.
Yeah, that one's scheduled for March 24th, 2023, so it's not super far away, and the other remake games that they've done for RE have been really well received. And of course, this is RE4, so there's a pretty high difficulty factor with that one, but because of Capcom saying, hey, we're not going to do any other major releases in this window, it's very likely looking like we're going to see Street Fighter 6 in April or May of next year. That is the most likely window. It's unlikely these plans will change, but it's not out of the question, because statements to investors, when you make them, they better be on the level. You can definitely say, hey, my bad, I messed up on this and that and stuff. But if you say or do the wrong things in your statements to investors, you can be on the hook from federal governments and other stuff, and they will mess you up hardcore for doing that. So Capcom has every incentive not to lie to their investors and the general public and whatnot. And so it's very likely that Street Fighter, this is going to be one of the first Street Fighter titles we've seen released out of that, a February or March window. But there's probably a really good reason for that. And the really good reason for that is Street Fighter V, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, because all of those had less than ideal launches for various reasons. And if there's a time for Capcom not to rush a product out, it's now, because based on statements from the head of the division, this is the head of the fighting game division along with other stuff, and this is Ryozo Tsujimoto, I think we're going to see a fairly complete product on Street Fighter 6's launch day, probably with some minor bugs, but nothing too egregious, because most titles have a few bugs in them, so they've got to patch out. But nothing like what we saw with Street Fighter V, where if they would have had maybe a few extra months of development time, they probably would have been able to ship the game with a story mode, a DLC store that actually worked, a bunch of costumes, and Alex. And instead, we basically got shipped with none of those things, which is literally one of the most egregious AAA launches from Capcom maybe ever.
It was dark days, and we've seen updates on like every front from Capcom trying to make sure that doesn't get repeated. So that makes a lot of sense to me that things would be much farther along. You could even argue that what we got with the beta was farther along than maybe what Street Fighter V was, but that's not what we're here to talk about necessarily. When I first heard this, I was like, well, so then the earliest we could potentially have things would be April 1st. Because technically that's when the next financial quarter starts, but I highly doubt that they're going to drop the game a week after Resident Evil 4 Remake comes out, still a little bit too close. And I was almost like, man, you're going to want to separate that by a few months. But I wanted to ask you, how far do you think like the minimum spacing out between a Resident Evil and a Street Fighter launch would be for these guys?
I mean, from an ideal standpoint, I really think about a month is you need at least a month, because most people are going to pick up these games, and what is a RE4 remake going to take to play through it and beat it? 20 hours or something like that for the main campaign, somewhere around there. And for most people, that's about a month's time. And so if you separate stuff out by a month, I don't think there's a tremendous amount of overlap with RE4 fans and Street Fighter fans, enough to the point where they'll probably buy both games if a really big fan of it and stuff, and space mount and play them accordingly. But too many great games to play is usually not too much of an issue, as long as they're not releasing right on top of each other.
Yeah, and then the other big thing that has recently shaped my expectations for a Street Fighter 6 release would be getting it on the Capcom Pro Tour for a year. But that seems to according to this, I would imagine they'll still launch it on the Capcom Pro Tour and have it be the game. I don't think we're going to get another year of Street Fighter 5, but that probably means that the Capcom Pro Tour moves as opposed to starting in late March is what it's normally done over the last handful of years. So I figured it would be beholden to that, but I think that things would just probably change around now, and the Pro Tour might start later in the year, something along those lines, and maybe we'll have a different time for Capcom Cup, maybe a shorter season this time around. I don't know, but I don't feel like that's, obviously it's not, as far as we can tell, going to release this earlier like it normally does. So they're going to have to do something there to get those things to line up, but I figured they could. It's just, it'll be different.
Yeah. And they have moved the CPT before, and the CPT is definitely a thing that Capcom cares about quite a bit, but it's also a bit of a marketing vehicle for the company, because it's not like Capcom's making money off their esports ventures. It's generally they're operating at a loss, and you can write that stuff off as a marketing expense and a few other things and whatnot, and it's a really good marketing tool. I think if you look back and see like all the DLC sales and all the other kind of stuff that they're doing, I think that there's overwhelming evidence that the CPT is a beautiful marketing tool for the fighting game community. And kind of what Capcom does in general. They can just promote the heck out of stuff. We saw the Phoenix Wright trilogy, and then the new trilogy, or new 2 sets of games, I should say, promoted a lot during the CPT. They can promote all their games. Hey, we'll probably see a lot of the RE4 remake commercials during the CPT when it starts up there. So it's just a really great vehicle for them to market stuff. But one thing you did mention, though, I want to go back to is the closed beta. And while that is definitely not a perfect product, the bugs that were there weren't overwhelming to me, and with how polished the game was already, it has me believing that Street Fighter 6 is not super far off from release. But how did you feel about the beta in terms of the context of the final game? Like, there's a bunch of stuff we didn't get: World Tour mode, the single player content, all that. We basically just got the online version of the game. But how did you feel like that state of the game was?
With all the extra content, that we have, I think 10 more characters for release, and like you said, all those modes and stuff, of course you need that. But if the game were confined to just what we saw, and like that was the extent of the game, I'm like, well, this is fine. This could release today and I would be fine with it from what I saw. I didn't see massive issues, massive bugs. And here we are talking about plenty of gameplay discussion afterwards. And even then it's like, yeah, it'll be vanilla. There are probably going to need to be tweaks, but even there, things feel deep, and it feels like there's a decent balance of risk reward and an opportunity versus counters to that opportunity. So it felt really good on that front. I don't want to say it's like, oh, it was perfect, but like it's hard to find issues where it's normally like, oh, well, you go, this is a beta, so that's obviously going to get fixed, and that's a huge problem. I didn't feel like anything like that manifested itself in the 3 days I was playing it.
Okay, very nice. And the next thing that I wanted to get to is there's a matter of the additional character reveals. Games typically have a marketing strategy of new characters and showcases right up till the moment of release. It's fairly rare for modern fighting game rosters to not be leaked in advance. Unfortunately, that just seems to be how the internet works in this day and age. But the showcasing of said characters often happens all the way up until the game is officially out in the public's hands. It's like, hey, we've got a preview here of so and so. But recapping here where we're at, Ryu and Luke were showcased right when the game was announced in February of 2022. Chun-Li and Jamie followed a handful of months later in June. And then there was about a 3-month window there where we didn't learn anything new after the initial announcement, and that's pretty typical, right? But so in June, right after we got those other characters, Guile followed about a week later, and then in August at Evo we got Jury and Kimberly, and then finally there was a batch of 4 characters in September at the Tokyo Game Show, which is a major event for Capcom all the time. We got Blanca, Dalsum, E Honda, and Kin. And that brings us to 11 characters to date who have gameplay footage shown off. However, Capcom said there's going to be a launch roster of 18 characters, but if the leaked image is correct, there are 22 fighters in total, and it's possible some of these will be boss characters or unlockables, or potentially even DLC. I'd bet more the former than the latter, but we'll see. But anyway, November's almost over, so if we get 1 to 2 characters a month revealed from this point out, even if it's just the 18 fighters confirmed for the trailer, that would still match up perfectly with an April or May release date. That's still very easy for Capcom to do. We might even go a month or two without anything. That sometimes happens as well. But my guess is we're going to get a set in stone release date during Capcom Cup in February, along with an official showcase of a handful of remaining fighters, probably people like Rashid, Ed, Akuma, and Aki, however you pronounce her name. They might sneak their way into the announcements or as some kind of unlockable fighters in this window as well, from February on to I think May. I think May is a little bit of a better window, but maybe I'll hit April and hit my birthday.
Well, they are doing Capcom Cup very differently this year. It's like an 8-day thing, which is kind of crazy to me, especially if it's in person, which it is. But they might, do like a kind of a Hanukkah approach to it and reveal a couple of characters, like on different days and whatnot, and that would be cool. Maybe they'll save everything for the end. And man, when we were thinking the game was probably going to come out in February, March, and we're going to get the release date maybe in February, March, it's still kind of like, man. But I do feel like as I look at all this information and the IR report and what's come down the pike thus far, May is where I'd probably put my bet, in the middle of summer and people are getting time off of school at that point. And it's like maybe May would be the strategy here. But I was looking up and like major releases for big games, it feels like they can happen most times of year. Obviously you want to go for the holiday season, but like Capcom hasn't been doing that very much with Street Fighter and fighting games, and so it's like I don't think that there's really any months that you're just going to cross off and good. So maybe April, but I'm guessing May.
Yeah, so we're both in the May camp. It seems like the most likely candidate right now. The one last thing I wanted to hit is that I also would not be shocked to see Capcom move around Rashid, Ed, and Akuma and Aki since they got leaked, and that they might be replaced by other fighters who were initially planned for DLC, and that are now going to be either hidden or somewhere around there. Maybe Vega or Balrog or something like that comes and replaces a few of those slots there. That's actually how Capcom has traditionally done things in the past, where if a fighter leaks and they can move around their release date, just to throw people off a bit, they do so. It's not always, but it's a general tactic that they've employed in the past. So just because we saw Rashid, Ed, and Akuma and Aki leak and they're not on the final launch roster doesn't mean they're actually going to be the next characters we see. If it is possible for Capcom to move stuff around, they typically try to, because they like to have some mystery in there. This is fighting games, man. Reptile's a hidden character in there, Akuma's a hidden character in there. This is like the history of fighting games. We expect some hidden stuff, some unexpected things, some unlockables, a few things of that nature, just to kind of have fun with, because that's our history. Why not do what works and what the fighting game community expects, right? Yeah. So that's just a little extra wrench to throw into things, but it should be a very fun wrench to mess around with when it happens.
I wouldn't be too sad if they just got rid of Ed and Rashid and Falk from the roster and put in cooler characters, but that's just me. So
you sure about that, John? It seems like we've hyped up Rashid a lot on this here. We might as well. Can they do something about Cammy as well? Can we leak Cammy like 15 times and just have her replaced by something?
I have a video talking about what I think could potentially happen to Cammy in Street Fighter 6 story-wise, and maybe she dies. I'm not going to give any more away. Does she come back, whatnot? But you can check that out, like on our screen, wherever that pops up on the screen from relation to where I am. There you go.
John may or may not have received a huge bonus this year for writing about Cammy dying. I'm just saying.